It's now 5 o'clock. We'll call the meeting to order. First order of business would be to approve our property and finance meeting minutes from November 20th.
So moved, Ellen.
Second, James.
Okay. I guess that just means they're approved. I'm a member of another body that goes through a formal approval, so I'm never quite sure how minutes are supposed to be handled, but we'll accept them as submitted. And we'll now move on to Kathy with the administrator report.
Okay, good evening. We have two presentations tonight. One from Smith, Elliott and Kearns, and the other one is from Barton's Associates. And so we'll start off with our local audit, and I'll turn it over to either Tina or Craig, and you're free to share your screen if you need to.
All right, thank you. This is Tina. I'll be sharing my screen here with the presentation on it and flow this through just like we've done in the past, where it's a PowerPoint presentation. It is not the detailed financial statements that we're going to review. It's more of the condensed high-level version with a couple detailed informative pieces that will kind of help explain the results and some comparisons to the prior year. So we'll do that. Let's see if I could share. Okay, so are you seeing my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. So, and you can still see it?
Yes, so we see the meeting notes version.
Okay. So, let's see here.
Tina, you could probably just work straight from the PowerPoint there.
Yeah. Okay. So you can see this?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So while I have this up, I'm not going to be able to see anyone else because you're kind of off to the side here for me. So if there are any questions or anything that you want to discuss as I'm going through the presentation, just interrupt me. But like I said, as in the past, we're just going to go through the PowerPoint presentation with the high-level summary and just touch on some of the key points based on the audit and the results of the audit. So I am Tina Curnow. I've been the one kind of presenting to the board here for a number of years. Craig is also in the meeting and will help with some commentary and answering questions just as in the past. But we are the two that for the most part work mainly on the district's audit and working with the staff to get all of our audit procedures completed. So this year, obviously there was a transition year from Corrine to Kathy, and Kathy came in late or middle, I guess, of the fiscal year of 1920. So there was a lot of discussion points back and forth, trying to work with each other to understand what needs to happen, how things are working, making sure that Kathy understood kind of how the school district had reported things in the past and how things could be reported, improved upon, a lot of discussions from that nature. So there was definitely a lot of good discussion this year between the two of us. She obviously has insight coming from another school district, so it's always nice to kind of merge a meeting of the minds and make sure that everything's being done as efficiently and appropriately as possible. So we definitely thank Kathy with helping us through the audit. We think that between her and us, we both learned and grew for the audit here. Obviously with transition, that tends to lend itself to some more discussion and some changes. And so we are presenting a little bit later than we normally do, but it's definitely not necessarily indicative of any issues that occurred, just the timing of COVID and getting everything done and squared away. So with that being said, I'm going to go through the presentation and like I mentioned, just interrupt if there's anything that you want to discuss. So as far as the results are concerned, what we're going to be presenting here is just the PowerPoint. So you would have the separate financial statements and footnotes and the letters that are also included with our information that we provide you. So we're going to go over some of those, some of the information in the letters as well before the end of the presentation. As far as the summary is concerned, you do have the unmodified audit opinion in the financial statements. So that is the good, clean audit opinion. It means that there wasn't anything that was found during the audit that required us to modify our opinion. So that's always a good, positive result to present to our boards, and just shows that everything that's being reported is materially correct. You had no findings reported this year that would go into the financial statements. So that's another positive to kind of take home as far as the school district is operating as needed as far as controls that are in place to help mitigate any risks of error or anything like that. You had a current year surplus for all of your funds except the capital projects fund, which was an expected use of reserves for the capital activity, the projects that you had planned on working through during the year. You took out the debt for in the previous year. So that was an expected use of reserves for the capital projects, but a positive change for the rest of the funds. You did create 2 new funds in the current year, the debt service and the self-insurance fund. This was mainly to help carve out that activity and track it better, because they are unique transactions that happen as far as being self-funded, and you do have a significant amount of debt. So recording the activity as far as the payments of that, any refundings, all of that will now be centralized in its own fund. Because of that, we'll see in one of the slides here in the presentation, when we look at the budget to actual activity, there are what looks to be some significant fluctuations from a budget to actual standpoint, but for the most part, they're driven by this activity originally being budgeted in the general fund, but then because of those new funds being created and reported separately in the financials, that lent itself to the actual activity being in different funds than where it was originally budgeted. And that's fine. It's just what happened for this year in creating those funds. And we'll highlight those. And then of course, going forward, that would not be a fluctuation. This year, you implemented GASB 84, which in the accounting world is a Governmental Accounting Standards Board standard. 84 is just the number that they apply to the standards in chronological order. This is related to fiduciary activities and how you report those activities. And based on that standard and the criteria that you need to go through to determine if an activity is fiduciary, your student activity funds that historically were recorded as fiduciary funds in your financial statements, they were moved out, reclassified essentially to a special revenue fund based on the new definition in the standard of fiduciary activity. So that was a change that occurred at the district. Really nothing from an internal change standpoint as far as how you're operating those funds. It's just a reporting standard for where it gets reported and how the activity is shown. So the audit report that's at the beginning of the financial statements, it is the unmodified opinion. So that means that the financial statements are fairly presented in all material respects. It's not an opinion on internal controls, and it is not an opinion on the results of a fraud investigation. We always like to remind our boards at all of our presentations that it really truly is just an audit of the numbers and getting those into the prescribed format for presentation. The management discussion and analysis, that is what is prepared internally at the district by management, and we review it to include in the financial statements. It's not audited, but it has a lot of comparative information. It has some more plain English type information, if you will, a little bit more reader friendly to follow. And so that is always incorporated in your financial statements as well. So here we're looking at the comparison for the governmental activities. This is your full accrual statements, the first couple number pages of your financial statements. And so this is where the internal records are converted to full accrual, and capital assets are recorded, debt is recorded, all of that activity that is not recorded internally. And so from a comparison to your 2019 to 2020 June 30 year ends, the big takeaways here essentially are the increase in your current assets. Your general fund had a pretty healthy increase in cash compared to the prior year. That's a lot of what drove your current asset. That there's no conversion there. It's strictly just a 1-for-1 when you go to the converting to full accrual. Your non-current assets had a little bit of a decrease, nothing too significant. Essentially, you had more depreciation expense charged on your capital assets than you actually had current year additions. So it just means that you didn't have anything extremely significant going on during the year for your capital activity. Your deferred outflows, your deferred inflows, and a very significant portion of your non-current liabilities, the fluctuations in those line items are mainly driven by the changes in the pension and OPEB activity that, again, you don't report that internally, but based on the two standards that dictate how that activity is reported. This is where, based on the actuarial valuations that take place, the estimated future activity for the pension and OPEB or the other post-employment benefits that you have, or insurance essentially, they get recorded on here. So this is what we always remind you each year, is that they are estimates. It is a very big dollar amount. It's a reporting standard. It does not mean that these are checks you're going to write in the near future. It's really just an estimate that needs to be reported on your full accrual financial statements. And we'll have a couple slides here later in the presentation that talk a little bit more detail about that. But we always remind you that you kind of need to take all three of those pieces and look at those together instead of individually, because of the multiple different components that make up those estimates and accounting for the change in them each year. Your non-current, or your liabilities in general, decreased, but looking at that activity, part of that was the debt activity that you had during the current year. You did have some refinancing activity, plus your normal debt payments that you're already obligated to make. So that's overall and also a contributing factor to the fluctuation in the liabilities. So you can see from a bottom line perspective, you do have deficit net position, but it's driven by the pension and OPEB reporting standards as far as what needs to be brought onto your books for liability standpoint. This slide is essentially just what I had explained as far as the variances are concerned. So this slide here, this is where I mentioned you're going to see what looks to be some significant fluctuations when you're comparing the actual to the budget. And so here's where I want to focus a little bit more time for the presentation, not necessarily comparing prior year to current year, but just looking at the current year in general and then compared to the budget. So your revenues, as far as your revenues are concerned, you did have an increase in your overall actual revenues. This was generated mainly from an increase in your local revenues. Your local revenues is, for the most part, your tax revenue and your charges for service, things like that. You did have a slight increase in your tax millage. You had over $100,000 increase in your interim real estate taxes, and also in your state revenue, you had an increase, normal increases. Obviously, the retirement percentage increased, so your reimbursement share increased as well. But you had a significant, I would say, one-time rental subsidy collection for your 2012 bond issue. When you went to refund that, you were able to actually utilize some reimbursement that was not utilized in the past, meaning filing the reimbursement forms for the previous payments made on that debt. So you were able to recoup a number of that reimbursement as well as the current year until it was refunded. And so that's why I say it was a one-time, because that was kind of a catch up once and done, going back to your normal collections here going forward. But in your state revenue, you can see an increase in the actual and then compared to the budget as well, partly because of that. The main thing I wanted to point out in addition to revenue activity is you can see in your local revenues and also down here in your support services for the expenses. This is where I mentioned as far as the insurance activity being budgeted in the general fund, but then the new fund was created for tracking self-insurance. So while it was budgeted in the general fund, the actual activity was moved to be reflected in the new fund that was created during the year. So that's what's causing these large fluctuations from actual to budget for your reporting in the current year. There's nothing wrong about that. It's just acknowledging that that is what that difference is. So it wasn't that there was anything budgeted incorrectly. It was just you moved where the activity was ultimately presented for reporting purposes. Same thing with the debt service here. You had obviously $4.9 million paid in debt service in the prior year. Nothing in the current year. That doesn't mean that you didn't pay any debt service. It just means that it's reported in the new debt service fund. But there was the normal debt service budgeted in the general fund. So that was 100% fluctuation there. So again, you made your debt service payments. There's no issue. It's just reporting wise, there's that swing there. The net effect of that essentially is shown down here in the transfer line item. You had a $500,000 transfer out in the prior year to the capital projects fund. 1920, you also did that and you budgeted for that. But the significant increase in the actual transfers compared to what you were budgeting was the creation of those new funds. So they kind of all almost net each other out. And then outside of that, you did see a savings, if you will, in your transportation costs because of the district being shut down for a number of months at the end of the year due to COVID. The transportation payments were negotiated. And so since there were no bus runs, you were able to make less payments to the bus companies than was originally budgeted and paid in the past. So you did see a reduction in your expenses as well from that perspective. So that's where you kind of, at the end of the day, you have a very significant surplus or positive change in fund balance in the general fund for 1920, mainly driven by those increases in the revenues that I had mentioned for the taxes and the rental subsidy. But then the savings or the decrease in transportation costs obviously helped as well. So a number of things aligned this year for the district to come in with that significant positive change in fund balance that otherwise wasn't expected to happen in 1920. And again, that's just kind of a synopsis of what I had talked about with creating the new funds. Capital Projects Fund, just showing a little snapshot here from 1819 to 1920 as far as the fund additions, the expenditures, and then in 1819 you had the new debt that you took out to help fund the projects that you are going to be incurring here in the next couple of years. So you had significant ending fund balance in 1819. You started using that fund balance in 1920, essentially starting to use the new bond proceeds that you took out for the capital projects that you have going on. These are just showing some of the significant expenses that were incurred in the current year for the Capital Projects Fund, the projects you had going on. The East York roof replacement, this project was started in the prior year and finished in the current year. You had a number of flooring projects, including the high school gym floor refinishing and tennis court reconstruction. They all started during the year and had some costs incurred in 1920. Cafeteria Fund, I'm not going to go into detail here. Just looking at the numbers, I think it's not going to be surprising for what you're seeing. There's really not a lot of changes in the Cafeteria Fund as far as from what you report internally to what you see in the financial statements. So really the fluctuations from the prior year to the current year are almost 100% related to COVID and the fact that the buildings were shut down for the last few months of the year. You were serving meals, but they were meals that you were receiving the free reimbursement rate for those meals that were served. Obviously not as many meals as you would have served if the school was open, and you were not collecting any paid amounts for meals that were served. It was strictly just the meals that were offered for free. So you saw a reduction in your revenue, obviously also a reduction in your expense because you didn't have to purchase as much, serving less meals and needing less supplies also. But at the end of the day, you still did have a small surplus in the fund, which is a positive thing under the circumstances to still come in positive. This is just a slide that summarizes your governmental fund balance. Your general fund obviously has a number of different carve-outs, if you will, for fund balance for different future expected costs that you're going to be incurring. So the general fund is kind of where you do that to carve out those future costs for multiple different reasons. You can see what you have here for retirement, capital purchases, debt service, technology, all kinds of different things that you're trying to kind of earmark your existing reserves for upcoming costs that you're expecting to incur. Your capital projects, essentially 100% restricted. It's just meant to be used for capital activity. Your debt service will be whatever residual is in there, which is not meant to be a lot. It's more of an in and out fund to transfer in what's necessary to make the debt payments. So there's not going to be a lot of residual left in that fund ever, but that is earmarked to be used for debt service. And then your capital reserve fund and your student sponsored activity fund. This is where you're seeing your student activity funds being reported as a special revenue fund. And so the $2.5 million is what lines up with that column in your financial statements. And 2.4 is restricted for capital projects as far as capital purchases and activity related to the capital reserve fund. And then you have $72,000 of essentially residual funds in the club accounts that will be used for student activities in the future. This is looking at just a quick total of a snapshot for the past 3 years for your governmental funds. So you can see your general fund has been increasing its fund balance. Your capital projects fund increased with the debt issue, and then now with using those reserves, using that new bond, the new bond proceeds had come back down in 1920, and of course we'll expect to do so in the future as you're using those proceeds for capital projects. The debt service is a new fund, so that's why there's nothing in the past. And then your capital reserve and your student activity funds is last there. This is looking at the graphs. Now, this is not in the detail of your financial statements, but this is part of what is in your management letter. And so this is comparing the district to the other LIU schools and then to essentially other districts within the state in your category of revenue from 51 to 75 million. in revenue. This is a year old, so those dates are correct. We do have to show this information a year behind in order to have the information necessary to compare you to the other IU schools and the state. But from a percentage standpoint, it's usually not too significant of a fluctuation. But this just kind of shows you how you compare to your peers, to the other school districts as far as where your revenue sources are coming from. And so you can see while the overall percentages are different, obviously, the takeaway is not. And it's just showing that overall, all of the school districts here in Pennsylvania are funded primarily by local revenue. That's your tax revenue, your charges for service, things like that. They're seconded by the state sources, and then third is normally your federal revenue. These graphs are the same thing, but just expense-wise. So again, 1 year behind, but basically just showing you that at the end of the day, while the numbers, the total numbers could be significantly different from district to district from a dollar standpoint, when you break it out into percentages, you're all kind of in the same pot as far as where you're spending your money. Most districts are spending 2/3 of their money, their expenses in salaries and benefits, which makes sense. You're essentially operating to provide instruction to students. So in order to do that, you have teachers and staff. So a lot of your cost is going towards the payment of the wages and benefits for those staff members. So you're very similar from a percentage standpoint with the other LIU schools and with other schools in the state in your general expense total area. This is just a quick graph that shows your ADM comparison and unassigned fund balance. And so essentially it's just taken directly from what the state provides on their website and compares you to the LIU schools and then all of the other PA school districts. As far as your footnotes are concerned, a couple highlights here for your footnotes. Note 1 is always your summary of significant accounting policies. You didn't change any of your policies this year, so that footnote for the most part is the same language as it was in the past. Your capital asset footnote, you can see your net purchases were about $2.2 million. And this was a small decrease, if you remember from the slide in the beginning, compared to prior year, because your depreciation expense did exceed your purchases in the current year. Note 9 is your bonds and notes payable footnote. Your total outstanding principal as of June 30, 2020 is just under $43 million. That was a decrease compared to the prior year, combination of refunding plus the normal debt payments. So if you keep everything the same, which we know never happens, but as of the snapshot in time of June 30, 2020, you had $42.8 million of principal outstanding and an expected $9.2 million of interest to be paid for the life of the existing debt. So here's where I mentioned we'll talk a little bit more detail about the pension and other post-employment benefits. Note 10 is your pension plan note. So all factors considered, at the end of the day, where we recorded all the changes in the deferred inflows, the deferred outflows, the liability, you had a net $900,000 of additional pension expense recorded on your financial statements that got all of those numbers to be where they needed to be. And just from a pension standpoint, if you look at the middle number in the bottom of the slide, you had just under $83 million was your proportionate share of the pension liability at PCERS. And one of the requirements in the disclosures is to acknowledge the sensitivity of the estimates that are involved in these calculations. And so the current discount rate that was used to arrive at that $82.9 million was 7.25%. So one of the requirements is to disclose what would happen to that liability if you would increase or decrease that rate by 1%. And so you can see here the significant fluctuation in just 1 percentage point when you're looking at the calculations that go into that estimate. So this is where we really heavily remind you that it is an estimate. It's not something that you should be making any short-term decisions on. It's honestly really something you don't have much control over anyway, but it's just here to show you that it truly is an estimate and it's not something that you need to budget for or expect to write a check for in the future. Note 11 is your other post-employment benefit note. So this essentially is what we're talking about with insurance. And it's very, very similar to the pension as far as the calculations that are involved, the fact that there's significant estimates involved in this. And so there's a footnote that talks all about your OPEB, other post-employment benefits. And so here again, the difference here is you do have your own district plan, and then you also have the PCERS component because of the healthcare component of the percentage that you contribute. And so the same things are involved in this as far as calculating the liability. There's deferred inflows and deferred outflows based on future activity that get amortized into the benefit expense. So here, similar to pension, you can see you had an overall just under $160,000 of additional benefit expense that was recorded when everything else was factored in. This was kind of the net effect of all those changes. And then again, down below, similarly with the pension, you can see that based on the current discount rate that is used, what the liability was for the district plan and for the PCERS plan, and if you would increase or decrease that by 1 percentage point, and how that would fluctuate pretty significantly with those changes. Looking at your federal programs, this is also part of your financial statements. It's what we call the CFA, the Schedule of Expenditures of Federal Awards. For June 30, 2020, you had total expenditures of just over $1.9 million. The program that was tested as a single audit or a major federal program where we dig a lot deeper into the compliance of the program and how you're spending your money and how you're reporting the information was your child nutrition cluster. There were no findings that were found during the testing of that program. And we just wanted to point out here that you did have some expenditures, COVID-related expenditures that you did charge into 1920 for additional costs that were incurred for that you got some funding for. That obviously is going to continue into 2021 for the residual use of the funding that you were awarded for those grants. So here just shows no financial statement audit findings, no major federal award program audit findings. The rest of the management letter, we talked about the graphs. We also put in the management letter any recommendations that it's not something that was significant that it needed to be reported as a finding, but maybe through our testing, we found some ways that we feel you could improve upon your procedures or information on standards that are coming down the line that are going to affect you, and just providing you information about that to help you get ready to implement those standards. So that's what the narrative portion of the letter includes. And so for this year in your management letter, there were 2 recommendations. One was over the reconciliation process of the non-cash balance sheet accounts, just to make sure that they are being reconciled regularly. Cash obviously is reconciled monthly, but non-cash account balances tend to not be reconciled as regularly because there's not necessarily a formal process for those. So just recommending that they are reviewed. I know that there are some procedures already in place to do that for those account balances. And the capital asset listing, you do maintain that internally. You've done that for a number of years now, where you're actually maintaining it. You're not outsourcing that activity. So just making sure that everything that's reported in those listings match the financial statements that are reported, match the actual activity for the assets that you have versus what was disposed of, just making sure that all that reporting activity lines up and matches back and forth. As far as new standards, there are a number of them that are coming out here in the near future or essentially have been finalized. It's just the timing of when you need to implement them. So there are three. The main one that we believe would impact the district is GASB 87, which is the lease standard. And we've been talking with you about this for a number of years now because it's been in the works for a number of years. It was delayed a number of times. Obviously, with COVID, there was another delay that the standards board allowed for a delayment in upcoming standards to allow for more time to get the information necessary to implement it. So you do have some more time here now to implement that. But that first one there that is on the slide, and then of course the details are in your letter, that's the one that we expect to have the most significant impact on the district once it is implemented. And we'll, of course, as in the past, work with management to make sure that everything gets accounted for properly for that. The other letter that I mentioned in the beginning, this is the required communication letter. It just has a handful of wrap up kind of terminology in there, just acknowledging the fact that there were no other issues during the audit, no disagreements with management. Management provided us a representation letter that basically said that they provided us everything we needed to do to perform the audit. And all the adjustments that were made from the time that we got the original unadjusted trial balance to what you see in the financial statements, all of those adjustments are attached to that letter. Kind of gives you the stepping stone for any changes that were made so that you can walk through from where you started to where you ended up. So in summary, what I mentioned in the beginning, unmodified audit opinion. So the good, clean goal of an audit to not have any issues that come out of it that require a modification to the audit opinion. There are no findings reported. You did have a good positive year for all the funds except for the capital projects, which had an expected use of reserves. And you created 2 new funds to kind of help structure and specifically account for certain activity so that you can carve out that activity and show that separately. Were there any questions?
Tina, another compelling presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. We always try to keep it short and sweet, but you are a school district, you have a lot going on. So we try to hit the high points and just kind of give you what we think is the most important for what you want to hear, what you need to hear. So obviously it's a quick presentation. It's very fast paced and there might be things that you didn't think of. So if anything comes up afterward that you have questions about, feel free to just run them through Kathy and we can get an answer for you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
All right, Kathy, moving right along.
Our second presentation is from Barton's Associates on the mechanical study, and I'll pass it over to Mr. Sells. Do you want to share your screen or would you like for me to present it for you? I'm sorry, you're muted.
Bob, you're muted.
I'd like to take control if I could. I have my PowerPoint up.
Absolutely.
All right. First off, I want to thank everyone. We really enjoyed working with Barry over the years, and we know he's been there a few years. But gather information from him and his staff and collect it in a written document that'll benefit your future planning for capital expenditures and also his staff as well. So the purpose of our study here was to visit every building, look at all the mechanical electrical systems. We looked at fire protection, plumbing, heating, cooling, ventilating, lighting systems, power systems, communication systems, throughout the building. We're familiar with a lot of buildings already because of the work we've done there in the past. We talked with Barry quite a few times and some of his other staff to get their native knowledge because they work with the systems every day. They know where their problems are, things that we can't see in a point in time look. And then we compare the information, what we get from the systems to the life expectancy. And mechanical electrical systems are typically a range of lifespan, useful life of 15 to 25 years, depending on the type of system. Materials in the building like wiring and piping and ductwork has a longer life of like 50 years, but it's the physical moving parts that have shorter periods. Looking at all your buildings, some common things that we saw, many of your buildings are not sprinklered. So we identified costs to do that should you choose so. As a district option, we identified a bunch of those that you can think about and things that will be combined with major renovation projects if they happen at buildings. There's also a lot of old plumbing in a number of your buildings and HVAC equipment. The plumbing and piping, nuisance problems, I'll call them. Pinhole leaks that show themselves with leaks on ceiling tiles or sometimes even behind walls that don't show themselves until they get down to the floor level and show themselves. So Barry and his staff are having to chase those things and try and find the source and fix them over time. So very expensive to replace all the piping systems. So you do what you can as long as you can to keep those things under control. We also identify most of your buildings have fairly efficient lighting, but nowadays we have LED available, which is much more efficient to do throughout. And you have a mix of exterior lighting that's already been converted, but there's still more to be done. And another recurring theme with your buildings, after talking with Vince Henry, is your cabling between your IT racks. It could be upgraded to more reliant and faster cabling system. From your racks out to your data drops and your wireless hubs, you're pretty good there, pretty up to date. But there's a recurring theme for all your buildings. I just have a real quick summary for each of the buildings here, where what we found, some of the problems that are short term, 1 to 3 or 3 to 5 years. And we looked at everything for a 10-year plan. You'll see that at the end of the presentation here. But Valley View, again, domestic water piping issues should be addressed in the shorter term here. Your unit ventilators that heat and cool the building should be looked at in 3 to 5 years. Yorkshire is your newest building. Therefore, things are in really good shape out there. So no recommendations for the next 5 years. They do start to come in some replacement recommendations, out in 7, 8, 9 years for the age of the building. East York Elementary School, again, plumbing shutoff valves. Part of the building still has original plumbing fixtures in it, which are inefficient from a water usage standpoint, minimally, and a maintenance problem as well as they get old and have to replace parts on them. That's one of your few buildings that had some older electrical equipment in it. Your district's done a great job in the 90s replacing most of your electrical and upgrading that, but this one here still has some old equipment in it we recommend replacing. The chiller should be replaced in 3 to 5 years. And there's a few buildings in the district where your master clock and paging system has recurring failures that are difficult to repair because parts are becoming harder and harder to get a hold of. And then the expertise of people to come out and fix them. Indian Rock, I would say, is probably your oldest from a MEP system standpoint and condition. I believe it was renovated last in the early 90s. It was the first of a series of building upgrades. But when that was done, there wasn't a complete controls upgrade program done there like was done with most of the other buildings in 2013. As a result, it's got a lot of pneumatic controls, which uses compressed air to read the space temperatures and control valves. That system is very old and out of date and getting very hard to replace components of it. So it's difficult to maintain temperatures out there. There's also some interface building envelope leaks with the unit ventilators. We originally proposed just doing a controls upgrade, short term, 1 to 3 years. But then after talking to Barry, and we tried this at other districts as well, and it just doesn't work well to upgrade controls first and then do equipment a few years later because you end up redoing work. So to avoid that, we're recommending a total system upgrade in the next 1 to 3 years out of Indian Rock. Again, plumbing is an issue with valves that don't shut off. And if Barry has to chase a leak, it's difficult to work on it if you can't shut it off. So it makes the shut off valves even more important then. And again, the master clock and paging system in Indian Rock. The middle school, the condenser compressor unit for the auditorium air handling unit needs to be replaced. We saw a lack of emergency lighting out there. One of two buildings we identified that at. Now you're getting into your larger buildings where you have a nice stage area. Your lining racks are old, difficult to get parts for. We recommend replacing that. Again, the plumbing thing shows itself. Unit ventilators and air handling units in 3 to 5 years, pumps and chillers. And then the hot water recirc pump, that's for your domestic water system. And again, the master clock. The high school, plumbing yet again. Your pool heating equipment out there, and the high school begins the 3 buildings that are your central campus there with Valley View, the education center, and the high school fed by a central plant. So your central plant generates steam, and that in turn goes underground over to the high school and does your pool heating. Also provides the heat for the pool environmental unit that heats and cools the pool itself. So that unit has some interior corrosion to it that needs to be addressed in the next couple of years. But there's a larger option coming up here when we talk about the central plant on whether you stay with steam out there or convert to hot water. So for the pool project, we have 3 options where we're looking at replacing it as is with steam and committing to that steam, that heating source over the next number of years, or converting to hot water, and whether the hot water for that particular system is going to be inside the high school or out at the central plant and piped in. Again, auditorium air handler CCU replacement, stage auditorium lighting again. The sign swing plumbing fixtures are very old and worn out, should be replaced. And then eventually unit heaters and air handlers for the rest of the building. Education center then, this was something we identified with a study a few years ago. It still hasn't been addressed. Your computer racks are basically in an open storage area in the lower level of the education center. The request is out there, and I think it's a good one, to enclose that system, get the racks safed off so it can be secured, and also install a what we call clean agent fire protection system. So if there is an event down there, you have a way to protect all that equipment, since it is a central system for the district. Again, plumbing fixtures, it's a smaller building, so not a huge cost. Being smaller, it's got fan and blower coil units instead of air handling units that need to be replaced in 3 to 5 years. And then adding a DS cooling system for the boardroom so that you don't have to bring chill water over just for that part of the building if you're just going to use that one system. The last building then, again, I mentioned this feeds multiple buildings at your central campus. But it does have some immediate needs because the fan coil units and air handling units, the controls are basically worn out. Again, difficult to get parts for it. The steam system, your central source, again, old worn out control valves and shut-off valves. And then on your chill water side too, control valves should be replaced. The chiller's out a little bit further, 3 to 5 years. You've had Trane come in over the year and do what they call a rebuild on chillers that makes them last longer. But even some of those rebuilds are starting to get to the end of their life. They can only extend it maybe, 5, 7 years. And then the steam plant, you've got 3 boilers out there now that generate steam. It converts it to hot water inside the plant, and then it gets piped out to the education center, Valley View, and the high school. We've identified 2 options and cost options. One, to replace the steam as it is, which isn't used near as much anymore. Steam is usually generated in a large campus where it's piped throughout the campus, like at a hospital or a campus. But since the steam's generated and used inside the plant itself to make hot water, there isn't a huge efficiency by doing that anymore. Plus the technical knowledge to maintain steam boilers is becoming a thing of the past. There's fewer and fewer contractors that you can rely on to maintain those systems and put them in. So, and actually, when you see the cost, it's actually less money to convert to hot water at the plant than it is to stay with steam. So what we did after we identified all these recommendations, and we have it organized building by building, we have a district-wide cost summary where we collect all the costs for all the buildings, year by year recommendation with the recommendations in it. We summarize the condition rating of it, the life cycle, recommended timelines, and you'll see here a year by year summary, a line item total, optional upgrades that you can consider. And those are the kind of things that you can spread them out over time too. When you're larger buildings, middle school, high school, if you can only afford to do a wing or 2 at a time, or you can combine it with some kind of renovation project and do it that way, that's certainly possible. We also had identified a column that anything that impacts energy or water usage as a cost savings that's going to be down the road and realized for, all the way down. So this is a snapshot of one of the buildings for our recommendations. I know it's a little fuzzy and hard for you to see, but just when you get to look at the full report, the left side here is system by system, fire protection, plumbing, HVAC, and electrical. The recommendations listed in the second column, the condition as we identified it, a little summary of the life cycle costs, the age of it, the expected life of it, how many years left. And you're going to see some negative numbers in here. And we talk about that in our upfront summary. You've got some systems that are beyond their expected useful life, but that doesn't mean they have to be replaced today or should have been replaced 2 years ago. You have the advantage of having a dedicated facility staff that can look after these systems and plan for them and make sure they're maintained well. So you can get more than your expected service life out of most of your systems, and your staff is doing that. They're doing a good job with in-house staff and hiring service contracts to make that happen. So, all of our recommendations are based on our observations of the systems that are out there, what Barry told us, how things are holding up, what he's having to deal with, and then we go from there. So once we get past the first third of the chart, you see a 10-year timeline starting with the end of the year, current fiscal year 2021 and going out through 2030, and where we think you could start with planning for these upgrades. Now, these numbers are all flexible. I'm offering the Excel spreadsheet that does this to Kathy and Barry, so that if you want to move things around and see where things total out, you can certainly do that. Once things are done, you cross them off the list, move to the next year, and if you don't get it done this year, move it to the next year, however your financial planning works out. The optional costs, a lot of the electrical things are your choice if you want to do them. If you decide it's a priority, so a lot of those end up at year or beyond year 10, you can plug those in anywhere. And then the energy column on the second to the right, and there's some notes on some of them. One thing we did include in here that we had done before and just decided to update with this round as well is a system by system summary, where instead of building and saying all the mechanical electrical systems, this is your chiller summary for the entire district. So all the schools are listed, what kind of chillers at each building, the year it was installed, the expected life of it. So it's just a different way to present the information that someone from a facility standpoint can get a snapshot of the district. So our recommendations are based on what we've seen out there, the information we got from Barry, what we've seen from our experience of doing a lot of other K-12 school projects and buildings. Just want to caution you that our numbers are all based on 2020 values. We didn't try to project out escalation, which could be easily 3 to 5% per year from what we're seeing with construction costs. Also not included with those numbers is any design costs for engineering, and if there's related architectural work to go with it. And one more thing I'd like to talk about is planning for these projects ahead of time, especially with your fiscal year that ends at the end of June. You got a short window, and every school district has this, and even higher ed has it as well. The summertime when the students are not in school, that we typically want to do a lot of these projects, and let the contractors in there do their thing and then get out before you come back to school in August. For that to work properly, we need to give contractors enough lead time so that they can purchase all their equipment, have it in hand when school lets out late May, so they can get into it, not have to wait for equipment, and then back that up. So a proper bid period for them would be January, February at the very latest to get bids in. So back that up and give the design team a good 3-4 months to design things. So we'd be looking at fall design for things you would want to do in summer the next year. I did identify a few projects that we prioritize in the facilities building for this summer. It's enough work that we could still maybe turn it around if you choose to do it and get it bid and get it done by the summer. It's nothing that involves long equipment lead times. So that's a possibility. Kathy, you want me to bring up a summary of the numbers that I have?
Sure. And I'll just remind the board that the full study was provided prior to this meeting. So if you don't have any questions today, you can look over the summary report and shoot those questions over to me, and we will send them over to Bob so that he can address them.
Can you see the black and white spreadsheet that's up?
No, we still see the presentation.
Okay, I have to leave that one and start again. Hold on. I feel I have to give you numbers after listening to that whole audit thing that had a few numbers in it. So you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, so what this is the first page of the recommendation summary. And what this does is year by year tallies up all the recommendations we had for each building, Valley View through the facilities building. So you can see for this coming summer, you know, if it moves ahead, 2021, $98,500. But then we start adding up things for Indian Rock, the high school, you know, so we're looking at, you know, again, all these choices are yours and how you want to prioritize these and spread them out. And we certainly would like to work with you if you need some assistance yet and planning some of these priorities. And then the last column here, don't take that as a total for the whole list of projects. This is just the optional upgrades. Unlike I said, a lot of things could get built into other renovation projects that might be coming up, you know, whatever your plans may be.
Okay, are there any questions?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity working with you folks. Hopefully we can help you, you know, work and get some of these projects done. We've done some in the past. We like to keep that relationship with you folks. Really appreciate it.
Bob, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Everybody careful out there tonight.
Thank you. So this leads to a greater discussion that we hope to have with you tonight. And I have a couple of, I'd say something just to gear the conversation. And so as we walk through the budget development and we look at our long-term budget forecasts and we look at making staffing decisions, we kind of find ourselves at a crossroads. And this is thanks to Dr. Krauser, who came up with this, and Dr. Kettleman, who came up with where we find ourselves and the decisions that we have to make and why we're bringing up this conversation with you today. And so there are three major components to where we are or where we stand, and that is financial, facilities, and instructional. And so I'll just remind you that we did have budget goals developed, and in that budget goal number 3 is operational efficiencies. And so as we're mindful of how we develop the budget and how we move the district forward, we also want to make sure that we're keeping to the very thing that we promised that we were going to do, and is develop a budget that addresses individual student pathways towards success, as well as contemporary pedagogy and modern curriculum. But we also wanted to make sure that we were intentional about operational efficiencies. And so we do have budgetary challenges. As you saw at the last board meeting, when we presented the preliminary budget, we showed a deficit for 21-22 of $3.4 billion. That moving forward, if nothing is addressed, will continue to eat into our fund balance. And so we always do revenue and expenditure projections. And although it's difficult to project, 18 months in advance, there is a necessity of projecting forward. And I always remind the board that it's important to remember that there are many assumptions made. And so those assumptions may not come to fruition, but that doesn't mean that we can't take them into effect. And so, or use them as we plan moving forward. And so you'll see, and this is very small, but I can forward this over to the board, that by the end of 25-26, we'll have a projected year-end fund balance of a negative $9.3 million. Now, that's assuming that we don't get any extra state money. That's assuming that we raise taxes at 3%. That's assuming that salary and benefits increase at a minimum of 2 to 3%, and that we make no budgetary cuts and find new revenues streams.
Effie, is that the unrestricted or is that the entire fund balance?
That's the entire fund
That's the
balance.
entire balance.
And so this is just a graph of what that fund balance looks over time. And so there are property and facility roads concerns. We have a general obligation bond of 2019 that we still need to expend. That bond was $9.5 million. There was a reasonable expectation to spend 85% of that bond by February of 22, which would have been $8 million.
Kathy,
The available funds.
Kathy, did you hear anything about whether we need to spend that 85% or there's any waiver on that because of COVID?
There isn't a waiver, but there is another caveat to that they monitor the negative arbitrage from that. And so in the same breath of that expectation, there is also a caveat that says that we can't make more in interest than what we have earned or expended. So, or what we owe rather. And so because interest rates are low currently, it doesn't appear that we are in any danger.
Good, okay.
Which I guess you can say that COVID has benefited us in that respect, right?
Good, thank you.
Sure. So we do have available funds of $9.5 million. And so a summary from the mechanical study, and I did not include the optional upgrades in this, but this is that one-page summary that Mr. Sales went over. And then we do have our 5-year capital improvement plan. And you can see that in 1920, we did not do the projects that we said that we were going to do. We've only did a selected few. And so the projects that we have deferred were over $4 million. We also have projects that we deferred for 2021, which is $3 million. And the projects that we have slated for 21-22 and 22-23 are there before you. So, in the next, the prior year, the current year, and the upcoming 2 years, there's about $8 million worth of projects that, the district had option to do. But that speaks of the need that our facilities have. And so we wanted to make sure that we were addressing that as well.
Kathy, before you move on, could you go back to that prior slide, please? Just want to ask a question. No, one more. The one that showed the summary of the projects from the presentation.
Go forward one.
And then the capital, that one. Yeah, stay there. Would you say that some of what's in the lower third of that screen or of that slide are also contained above? In other words, did Barton identify certain other things, or are these completely separate?
They're completely separate. I was intentional about taking out the items that Barton's would address in their study.
All right, thank you.
And that it's a good thing that you brought me back to this slide, because in the bottom portion of it, and I have a duplicate slide in here, but in the bottom portion, there's a plus sign next to the 2021 and the 21-22. There are certain projects listed that do not have budgeted figures. So those numbers, those figures or budget numbers could be higher than what's presented there.
Some of the 1920 something 2021, is that the doors? Is that the big one out of that 3.2 million?
The doors are included in here.
In the 3.2? Are they in the 3? Okay,
yes.
Thank you.
And then we have the road towards instructional model and grade realignment. So we didn't want to have the conversation today without addressing the three components of it, which is financial, budgetary challenges, facilities and property, and then instructional model. And this is where I turn it over to Dr. Williams.
Thank you, Kathy. What I'd like to do is bring up my screen.
Did we lose Dr. Williams?
No, I think. Looks like he was deep in thought there with his computer.
No, I think we lost him.
He did.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I'd like to talk with you tonight is about some strategic principles that we want to lay out for help us in the decision-making process to figure out how we're going to proceed with our needs. You've just heard a host of things that we need to worry about as far as facilities needs. So we can continue to patch those things as they're needed to be patched, or we can look for ways to spend those funds more wisely for long-term benefit. And for us to be able to do that, we have to lay out some guiding principles, some strategic principles. And we've divided them into two distinct chunks. Instructional is one chunk, and physical plant and fiscal is another chunk. I want to make sure you guys can see the words on the screen there. Are you able to?
Yeah.
Okay. The first item in instructional is to create learning spaces that promote collaboration among grade levels and content areas. One thing that we've realized through the pandemic process is that teacher planning and planning for lessons improves dramatically with the ability to collaborate with one another. So collaboration has become something that we should have always cherished, but we didn't realize how much we didn't have it until this pandemic. So we need to create learning spaces that will promote that kind of activity and that kind of growth among the staff. Another thing we need to do in the instructional view realm is to provide more equitable access to educational resources, personnel, and programming. So we have our each grade below grade 6 divided up into two halves of the district, and that's not the most efficient way to serve our students and to provide the personnel needed to meet not only the regular education needs, but also needs for English language learners, needs for special education, and a whole host of other support services that go into making sure that students have what they need to be successful. So those two strategic principles are for instruction are something we feel very strongly about. And then when we get to the physical plant and fiscal strategic principles, we have three areas there. The first one is to improve efficiencies in annual ongoing operational costs. It's kind of a no-brainer. You want to do that all the time anyway. But as we are looking to spend money to repair facilities or to replace items, we should look for ways to do that most strategically. so that we can generate long-term efficiencies and improvements. Sometimes it may be wise to spend a little bit more on something to get more life out of that something. The fourth one is to address end-of-life, near end-of-life mechanicals and infrastructure for long-term results. You heard a lot about that from the Barton study, so I'm not going to elaborate too much on that. We just have more than a handful of systems that really need to be addressed in the next 1 to 3 years or 1 to 5 years. And then the last item is to effectively manage future personnel costs by leveraging physical plant improvements that align with instructional goals. So we're trying to tie back the physical improvement needs back to instruction so that we can not only have more efficient facilities and more efficient ways of operating the physical plant, we're also looking for more efficient ways to deliver instruction and to maximize those resources, because they're not going to become more plentiful as time goes on. They're going to be more challenging as time goes on. So those are the 5 strategic principles that we wanted to lay out for you and have a conversation about, and frankly, look for a recommendation to the full board to adopt these strategic principles to help guide our decision-making as we move forward. At this point, I'd love to entertain a conversation about it. Questions, whatever you want to know, whatever you want to talk about.
So Tim, you're number 1 there. Your case is it improves performance of the teachers, but it doesn't really do a balance between how much it improves performance of the teachers and what the overall cost is to that. And I guess what I'm challenging you on is we look down the road and we look at these numbers. We're solving one piece of something that doesn't solve the big problem. I guess I'm not saying that very well, but.
Okay, what do you see as the big problem?
The big problem is we can't afford to do all the facility stuff that's on there and pay at the levels we're paying or employ the number of staff. The benefits and salary portion of our thing is not sustainable. So what we're saying is we're going to build a bunch of stuff so we can collaborate, but that doesn't fix that problem.
No, what fixes that problem is number 5. Number 5 is how we use our existing resources more efficiently.
The circular problem I'm having is that right now we're in deep trouble if we look at that thing. So if we look ahead and say, we're going to pick a number, we're going to spend $20 million to fix this. We don't have the $800,000 a year to do that. So we're in this tight problem of being able to pay for the money to do the long-term things you're recommending. And maybe I'm the only one that feels that way. So I'll be.
You're not recommending anything at this point.
Yeah, well, you're going down a path though. I see myself being led.
We're going down a path that requires us to focus our conversation about what we're going to do going forward. You could decide that we're just going to patch things as we go along, which is the strategy we have been using. I don't think that's a good long-term strategy. And I think whatever we do, different than addressing the individual needs when they pop up, is going to happen over, I believe, a decade. It's not going to happen in 3 years. I think we're looking at really long-term to address these needs and to accomplish these strategic principles in whatever shape that takes.
John, let me back you up. This is Steve. I would just say that the mood of the verb, whether we're saying, I don't know how we will do this, or I don't know how we would do this, is irrelevant, because the headline is I don't know. I'm looking at the same projections you're looking at without doing anything to the physical plant. I don't know who's running the screen, but if you could scroll us back to those 5-year projections, irrespective of whether we're being whether anything is on the table as a proposal or not. I just don't, I don't know where the money comes from. And I don't, I just need to see a plan that results in something other than the rapid exhaustion of the fund balance, you know, at the end of the, sometime during the 2023 academic year. It's a little frightening.
If I could ask just clarification, Tim, as I'm hearing this, part of what we need here with these goals or principles is the grade consolidation. And we have that, and we have these buildings that are crumbling before our eyes. Those are the two, am I reading that right? Those are the two big things.
The buildings are, to use that phrase, crumbling before our eyes.
Okay, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but at any rate.
But your point's taken. And we have grade level realignment is a way to more efficiently deliver instruction. So for example, if via grade level realignment, because if we implement that and we save, we prevent having to hire, say, 5 teachers, well, that's
a good thing.
Well, financially, yes. And we're still meeting the kids' needs in the same way we're meeting them now.
Right.
So if that money that we would have to spend on those 5 additional teachers, and that's a number I'm just pulling out of thin air, that's money that is better spent on a more efficient infrastructure to deliver instruction in a realigned kind of a situation. So it's a balancing act. If we do nothing, we're going to be spending more on personnel. If we do something strategic, we'll spend more on debt service, but less on personnel.
Unless we grow class size.
Well, that would be an option.
Well, to continue, I'm sorry, Ellen, but let me.
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
Finish this. Do we have numbers on the piece of grade consolidation that I think it would be helpful if we do this, then we're going to save that. Do we have that available, or is it still too nebulous for us to really do that?
Well, I guess about a year and a half ago, I did provide some numbers along those lines. I can resurrect that stuff and send that back out to you.
Well, I'm just thinking it might help to really look at that, because I agree with you. I'd like to do that. I mean, I think that has been proven over time. And for me, the feedback from the faculty has really sort of underscored that. I was sort of drug along to that plan, kicking and screaming, but I'm sort of coming around to that idea. But I think it might help all of us if we had that in black and white to sort of compare with the previous page that was sort of jarring, at least to me, pretty scary.
Yeah, I can pull that back out and get it back out to you.
Actually, Tim, you've sent us some stuff more recently. I think some of the work that Dr. Ketterman did talks about class sizes and things like that, maybe a little bit more updated. But as I look at some of this, create learning spaces that promote collaboration among grade levels, I think I hear us talking about the teachers, not the children. And I know this is to benefit the children.
An example of collaboration space that are used by children is at Indian Rock. You have those areas in the pods. That's a collaboration space.
I get that. I just, maybe it's just, again, it's just the wording, you know, that's just me. I think we need to have we at any point, I know, I guess I kind of know just from conversations how the teachers feel about this. Have we had conversations about any of this with community members, with
No.
community groups, nobody.
We need to adopt some strategic principles before we do that. We need to,
Okay.
we need to have some general direction, some way to, something to articulate. I don't think it's a wise idea to just put a blank slate out there and say, tell us what you want.
I agree. But I think, looking at I think the community is going to should have input into this is what I'm saying. And so it doesn't get done, right away. But, and I realize we've lost almost an entire year, but that's not of our doing. It's just, that's the way the world has gone. But I think we need to hear from, I think we've heard from parents, but somewhat, but we still need to hear from parents and from the, from the community. And I don't know. I think this is a very long strategic process that we have to look at very carefully in order to, these are two big statements under instructional, that's for sure. Fiscal plan is a whole other thing because that's huge. That can be huge or huger or the biggest thing we've ever done. If you look at some of what Barton's has said today, there's no question that our buildings need help and will continue to need help from now until forever.
Let me just ask for a second, if you'll indulge me. I've been on the board off and on, probably 8 years total. And one of the things that I'm going to posit here is that we really don't act as a strategic board. And this is what Dr. Williams is asking us to do, to think strategically. And that once we lay down a strategic plan, we stick with it. That's not easy. There are changes that would have to be taken into account. COVID was a big one. But if we, for example, decide that we want to have a footprint that does the things that create the efficiencies and so forth that are being presented to us by the administration, have been over the course of the last couple of years, then that gives them what they need to deliver to us what we need. But if we keep shaking the strategic blanket, that every time we have one of these conversations, we're essentially starting over. What's our strategy? What's our strategy? The last time we had this conversation, if I recall that, dealing with the footprint of the district, using the concept of having all the children in a particular grade in the same building, we decided we really didn't want that. We told administration that the little kiddies needed to be in regional buildings. Is that correct? Is my memory as old as my head?
That's what I remember.
Yeah,
I remember.
So here
something
we
along those
sit.
lines.
All right, so is that the footprint? And I'm not suggesting that it should be. I'm just suggesting that we need to give administration exactly what they've asked for, and that's a footprint. That's a strategic decision. If we believe what they're saying, we'll give them that footprint. If we don't believe it, or if we think there are factors that would somehow or other compromise it, they need to know that. Once that footprint's established, from that point on, that gives us what we need to take Barton seriously, to look at our capital plan seriously, and begin to do the things that support that footprint. I don't think any of us wants to put a lot of money into a building that's not going to be used the way it's used today, or to direct dollars in a way that causes us to go in and rip something out that was just put in a year or two ago. This is why strategic planning is so critical, and to be able to hold on to it. It isn't going to be perfect, but we've got to have marching orders. We have to give them marching orders. Then once that capital plan is put in place to support the strategic plan, then we can do things that essentially we're pretty good at, which is kicking the ball not too far down the road, but maybe 6 or 8 months at a time, when a system needs to be replaced or needs to be addressed. An example of that would be the roof at the swimming pool. That was certainly not a strategic decision. That was reactive. And we decided we wanted to do it. Our other choice would have been to close the pool. Simple decisions in the sense that there aren't too many moving parts to it. But this is why I think we're having this conversation. Again, we're not giving the administration a strategic footprint to work with. That does not say go forward and spend the money. It says go forward and give us a plan to spend the money. Then we get to the things, the other big moving part here. Kathy gave us a projection that shows over a 5-year period a cumulative $10 million deficit in the fund balance. I can remember maybe the second year I was on the board, having a conversation with our business manager at the time, about how you calculate a structural deficit. Well, Kathy gets it. She understands it. And she needs to get us to understand it. That was done, Kathy, if I heard you right, with a 3% property tax increase year after year. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, with the
All right,
exception
gang,
of the
that's a
current year.
serious problem. There aren't too many things from a high level that we can deal with. The footprint clearly is one of them. The tax rate is one of them. And John mentioned the other dimension that people really don't want to talk about, and that's increasing class sizes.
Can I add something to this mix as well?
Absolutely.
Again, I very much on the same lines, and just want to reiterate, I think, what Joel's saying about Dr. Williams' position. And yes, what we're trying to do here is change the conversation a little bit. You know, everyone's already talking about the realignment or about, you know, what we're doing with our buildings. As Joel said, we're trying to put forth a strategic plan and get forth those things that we think strategically are important and adopt that, say, this is what we believe, again, so that we have something to reflect back on. The idea is from here that yes, what we will do is exactly what Ellen said, and Dr. Williams has a plan for that, to move forward, get our stakeholders together, and use research out there, use our needs, and use people's wants to formulate what we desire the district to look like, both instructionally and physically. And then at that point, move forward with what that means as far as, are we going to hire more teachers, hire less teachers, you know, redo our buildings, exactly repair our buildings, just what those pieces look like. But we go from that initial, yes, we believe these components. And if we truly believe that, then what are we going to do to support that? And it is a process. As Ellen said, this is a long process. But instead of continuing to throw something out there and saying, well, should we do this or should we do that? We're trying to take a more strategic approach. My one other comment is just on instructional one, and perhaps that could have been better written about creating learning spaces, is creating the structure and the rooms that meet the instruction that we're doing today. You know, every one of our buildings have been built in 1950 or 1960, with the exception of one. And they're designed for a very specific learning model, and not necessarily even for the students that are in those buildings or will be in those buildings. So it's important that we look at those components. And we do believe that there will be a solution as we put these items together, that we can offer the most fiscally responsible solution. I don't know if that's helpful, but I just wanted to give another perspective.
I think it is, Vince, and maybe Tim, if I could get a little more insight, and I like the way that you've framed this. It's very clear, and it is strategic. I guess in terms of the board plugging in, if this is the framework that we choose to look at, how often do we visit these buckets? I mean, is it a quarterly thing? Is it a yearly thing? Is it a, you know, how does this roll out in your view?
Yeah, in my view, anytime we're going to be making any kind of facilities decisions of any type whatsoever, we need to look at these 5 things. You know, is what we're contemplating doing here fit here? Is it part of the strategic direction we're trying to go with facilities? So it would be looked at pretty much every property and finance meeting, because most of those meetings have something related to physical plant in it. And we would be reflecting on these strategic principles to see if whatever we're discussing fits well with these strategic principles. So anytime we're talking about anything physical plant, that's what we're looking at.
And how long do these principles stay in place? Is this a 5-year, a 10-year? I mean, how often does it get updated over time?
I think I'm seeing this as like a 10-year thing because it's going to take us 10 years to address facilities needs, in my mind.
Okay. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Dr. Williams, a question if I may?
Yes, sir.
Would it be helpful from your perspective if we as a board came to some kind of consensus PDQ that looking at all the budget figures that we reviewed tonight, all the projects and your strategic principles, we better decide that we've got to do more with less over the next 5 to 10 years. I think in the past, we've been able to throw money at a problem. From what I'm seeing in the figures, we could throw money, but we don't have it. We could say we're throwing money, but we don't have it. Maybe have to come to grips with that, which is going to lead to challenging some of our sacred suburban principles. That over the top, or is it fair?
No, I think that's a very fair assessment. Historically, we've been able to throw money at whatever came up. We're not going to be able to sustain that going forward. That's not sustainable.
So we've got to do more with less.
Have to do more with less.
And everything's on the table when it comes down to class size, how we configure buildings. You name it, we've got to consider it from that perspective.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
So Tim, if I pick your 5 topics here and I say, yeah, I love them, this is the way to go. What I'd like to see, and this is a little, I think, of what James was saying, is that over the next 3 years, 4 years, these are our strategic goals. Goal number 1, we're going to do this. Here are the 4 key results that I expect to see, and here's how I'm going to measure success. So it's not just this thing. It's, am I going to save money? Am I going to improve test scores? What are the things I'm going to do, and specifically how am I going to measure them? I guess I'd feel more comfortable then.
Yeah, I think maybe you're viewing these as goals.
Well, strategic principles in my mind is a direction. So yeah, they're a goal.
See, I don't see them as goals. I see them as guiding principles to figure out how we're going to proceed.
So if that's the case, your guiding principle number 1, what I want to see under there are 4 key initiatives that are specific goals with measures on there. So we can bandy about whether or not that's the goal or if that's the grand scheme, but under it, there's got to be something specific that we're going to move toward. Now, we don't have to do those immediately, but that circles back around to my initial whine about money and direction. If creating learning spaces to promote collaboration, what's it going to do for us? Is it going to improve teaching? Is it going to save numbers of teachers? If they're the goals, then by how much and when? Is it going to improve teaching so test scores go up 5% and costs stay flat? Somehow I'm trying to tie it all together, and I'm okay with these as guiding principles. There's just got to be that next step.
And John, I want to jump in there. I mean, in the years that I've done strategic plans for when I was working in the corporate sector, everything that we did had to fall under these strategic principles.
Right.
So every budget we did, we had to put it into the buckets, and it had to sit there. And if it didn't sit there, it didn't get pushed through. Is that what you're envisioning?
That's right.
Tim?
And if you say it that way, that's exactly what I'm envisioning. But then tied to that, if you put something in bucket number 1, you have to have a result, a key result from that, and you have to have how you're going to measure success.
That's right. Yes, you're exactly right. I mean, and that would require, you know, to Ellen's point, you got to get buy-in from all the constituents. So when you have departments that are bubbling up their budgets and their goals for the year, it's got to fit under one of these high-level initiatives, right?
I'm okay with the principles before the buy-in, because the buy-in is going to happen when you specifically identify those key results. That's when, you know, one of the results might be, well, yeah, I really am going to move all kindergartners to one location.
So
what's if that's a result, then, you know, what are you going to see? What's the benefit of that, and how are you going to measure it?
So the principles that Tim had on the screen, let's talk principles.
Okay.
There's nothing to argue with any of those 5 principles.
Agreed.
Only an idiot would say any of those 5 things are not good things to do.
Correct.
So we've been talking for like 30 minutes about whether we agree with those principles. Of course we agree with those principles. So it's all in the output of that. Like you said, John, okay, now from the principles, there are actual goals. We jumped ahead in the conversation because we're trying to figure out, are we gonna spend a lot of money on buildings when we don't have it, or what are we gonna do? I agree 100% with the principles. I'm not a huge fan of strategic planning because I think it's a lot of vague stuff that you say that it's all makes sense and it's common sense, but it doesn't get you to the end goal. So my problem right now, I agree 100% with your principles. Let's ratify them and go with it. We need to somehow do more with less, like Rich said. We had a conversation that I thought was going to go in the right direction a couple weeks ago, or you commented that we were looking at what we could do with the footprint that we currently, with our current physical stuff, to combine those grade levels. And I was like, yes, let's do it, because that's more with less.
Yeah.
Honestly, it's more with what we have, because we're not getting more. We're not getting more buildings. The fact that you came back in the last meeting and said it didn't work still mathematically makes no sense at all to me. Because you guys said you had, hang on a second, I gotta look at my numbers. Like 78 classrooms in your 4 buildings, elementary buildings. And as near as I can calculate, we have about, I don't know, 11 or 12 classes per grade level. That does not divide, like there's less class levels, there's less classes than we have rooms.
Well,
So to
Mr.
say that
Coman,
we can't work it out, as near as I can tell, we could work it out with 3 buildings. Based
Well-
on the class numbers that you said you had in the building, the classrooms you had in the buildings. And I know that's not right, but those numbers didn't add up to me. And I didn't like the answer that there was no way to figure it out with what we had. Because
Well-
guys, we have to figure it out with the buildings we have.
and that's why our intention is to go back to the drawing board. We brought you a lot of parts and pieces over the last year or two to say, well, this is one idea, this is another idea. You know, here we could do this, we could do that. And we're saying, hold it, let's stop. Let's go back to a starting point and establish this starting point as these strategic principles. I believe Dr. Williams immediately wants to get started to pull a comprehensive analysis together, including all those stakeholders, as Ellen was talking about, examining our buildings, their lifespan, what they can do, what they need, examining our the utilization of the rooms as they are, the buildings as they are, incorporate all the things that we've discussed over the last couple of years and be able to compare them all at one time, as opposed to pulling one item out and look at that bigger picture. I think we want to consolidate all of that research we've been doing so that we can answer all those questions well.
I think this problem's simpler than we're making it. So if you sat down and looked at Valley View and you said there were 24 classrooms in it, I don't know if that's right, wrong, or indifferent, but you need to look at it and you need to go, okay, if I wanted to put K-1 in that building, how many classrooms do I have? And how many teachers do I think I need? Because the buildings that we have and the class size discussion aren't independent. If you came and you said, that's the K-1 building, if you decided that's the K-1 building, and I have X amount of kids and I have X amount of classrooms, that's what you got. If you can only fit 15 classrooms in that building, or you can only fit 20, that's the max class size that you can have. You're done. We just need to make the call on what we want to do, how we think we would lay out classes in those buildings. If that's K-1 in Valley View, which seems to make sense to me, 2 to 3 in Yorkshire, which also seems to make sense to me. And then I'm not sure what to do with East York and Indian Rock, but if it's fourth grade in Indian Rock and 5th and 6th in East York, and the middle school gets 7th and 8th, make a call on that and then run the numbers after you do it. Because if we're trying to start, like, it's the only way to do it. We have to assume those are the buildings we have. Then we know that we know the numbers, we can figure it out. We have to be able to figure it out, but we're going to go around and around again. We had a lot of data a year ago or a year and a half ago, and I feel like we're starting over again. And it boils down to, we have those buildings. Let's figure out how to fit the classes realigned. I'm on board with your program, Tim. I think most of us are on board with your program of realigning the grade levels. Give us a proposal that says how you're going to do it. And then we might have to swallow a bitter pill on the class sizes being larger than they need to be. I think we're going to get there anyway, because we can't afford the teachers.
So yeah, Tim, I think
That budget problem we have only goes away if we handle the staff costs.
And
I don't like that answer at all, but it's the only way that problem fixes itself.
And that's why grade level realignment is the only way to solve that problem.
Is there anybody on the committee that doesn't think that's a correct approach?
No, I think well, what I was going to say is, I think, Tim, you're hearing from the committee that people are all in with your strategic, whatever you call them.
But I think if we do what Mike, and I don't disagree with getting it together, but I don't think that the class realignment that Mike is talking about, I think we're jumping ahead or jumbling, or are we following the strategic plan? I mean, right now you want to know, not only this one will only affect, realignment of classes is going to affect, it's going to affect everything. So you have to be careful. I have no problem with having a strategic outline or strategic plan, if you will. I have none at all. I think it's a good thing to try and work with. But if you're going to just jump right in there and I agree with Mike, are we going to just jump right in there and say, okay, this is how we're going to align the classes, or we're going to look at this method, or we're going to look at that? We've already got a decision made before we've even decided that we want to, before we've even said, yep, let's go, let's follow the strategic plan.
Ellen, it's not a decision. It's a starting point that can be costed out both educationally and financially. It doesn't mean that the footprint that gets laid down in the first iteration has the board's approval. It's the whole package. It has to be educationally sound. It has to be financially sound. It has to be supportable in the long term. But Tim needs a place to start. He needs to give us a starting point for us to consider. It is not saying that's it. We're drawing the line in the sand. That's the footprint.
No, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that you've got to approve the strategic plan and then you have to hear from stakeholders. Then you get to offering up some of these suggestions, but we all seem to have some suggestions ready to go. Is Tim okay with that? I mean, you know, we've been thinking about this for 18 months now, probably.
Well, if I could just throw out that really in keeping with board responsibility, it's our job to approve these guiding principles, and it's the administration's job to come up with the alignment. That
The implementation.
Or the
correct.
suggestions for alignment, you know.
well,
You're assuming that we're realigning, you're right. I mean, you're.
well, yeah,
Let's
but
let Tim's.
what I'm saying is I don't want us as board members to get out in the weeds with the minutia. That's administration's responsibility.
Tim,
The next step after, if the board adopts these principles, is to refer it to the Academic Standards Committee to develop a recommendation after involving stakeholders. And I laid that out in my recent communication to you.
so
Yeah.
then the next step, Tim, is the next step a formal adoption of these principles by the board?
At the work session, yes. If you're willing.
And is that something you're asking the Property and Finance Committee to recommend to the board?
I would like that as a recommendation out of committee, yes.
Committee members?
I'm fine. Take it out and put it up for a vote, see what happens.
Roll with it. We got to get moving.
Okay. Thank you very much, folks. Any other final questions on that?
Hey, Tim, you got quoted on snow days again.
Oh,
Just so
hope it's
just
good.
thought I'd
Hope
throw
it's
that
not
in
red.
for the end. Just thought I'd throw that in for the end.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Sears, that concludes the administrative reports.
Thank you, Kathy.
You don't
Like
have
your-
another 30 minutes?
Oh, God.
I don't think we need to.
We're just about done, aren't we?
We are. I just wanted to add a couple things just to emphasize what we've been talking about for a long time right now. We know that we have a financial goal over the next several years to eliminate the structural deficit without compromising our academic mission and performance. That's a statement that should not have to be made. But the reality of today's economic situation really has to be considered. We're not floating in money. We don't have the ability, even with Kathy's projections of a 3% tax increase every year, which I would personally tell you is untenable. Taxpayers at every level have to feel that they're getting real value for their investments in public education. And these continual increases are unsustainable, and I think they're morally questionable. That does not mean that we do nothing. And today's presentations in particular, I'd say the last one that Tim gave was what we need. They continually illustrate that there are significant needs in the short term, the long term, and strategically. Things like changing the footprint that we've either patched or ignored. And it's time for us to take the step, I believe. And I think at least approving these principles formally is a step in the right direction. We also have to take a look seriously at the information that Bart has provided. We have to take a look seriously at the capital plans and integrate these so that when we spend the dollars, we're spending them as wisely as we can. Is it perfect? It is not perfect. Will we spend dollars that might end up in hindsight looking like they were wasted? That's probably going to happen a time or two. But that's a chance we have to take as a board, but to do it as best we possibly can, and with the confidence that we'll get support from the community when we make those decisions. That's my report for the day. Vince, we got any public comment?
We do not have any public comments specific to the finance and the facilities and finance. So we'll hold these for the planning meeting.
Tim, I want to ask your guidance on that. If they were posited for this meeting, should they be written or read into the record in this meeting?
No, because
they're not pertinent.
Yeah, we put public comment out for the board meeting maybe a little too early. Maybe we shouldn't put it out so early because it's intended, they're getting on there to make comment about at the regular board meeting. So
Okay.
I think we should hold it.
Okay, we'll defer then for that purpose. Any other commentary for the good of the order?
Oh, hey.
Okay, I'll call the meeting adjourned. Thank you, everybody.